Somewhere beneath the tangled roots of a Philippine jungle, there is a hole in the earth that swallowed a fortune. 2,000 trucks, brand new, barely touched by human hands. Engines that had never pulled a real load, tires that had never seen real mud, paint that still smelled faintly of the factory. And in 1946, the United States Army drove them, one by one, into a pit dug deep enough to hide them from the world and buried them alive. Why would the most powerful military machine in human history destroy the very equipment it had spent millions of dollars building? Why bury trucks instead of giving them away, selling them, or shipping them home? The official explanations only tell part of the story. The rest was buried along with the machines, and it has been waiting quietly for someone to dig it back up. To understand why a government would choose to destroy wealth instead of using it, you have to go back to the final months of the Pacific War, when the American military machine was running at a scale almost impossible to imagine today. By 1945, the United States had built an industrial war engine so massive that factories in Detroit, Toledo, and dozens of other cities were producing military vehicles faster than any war in history had ever demanded. Dodge alone manufactured hundreds of thousands of trucks for the war effort, from the rugged WC series half-tons to heavier cargo haulers, engineered to survive deserts, jungles, and battlefields alike. These vehicles were shipped by the tens of thousands across the Pacific, feeding the enormous supply chains that kept American forces moving through island after island. The Philippines became one of the largest staging grounds in the entire theater. Bases sprawled across Luzon and Mindanao. Warehouses, motor pools, and depots stretched for miles, packed with parts, fuel, ammunition, and vehicles waiting to support what planners believed would be a brutal, drawn-out invasion of the Japanese home islands. Nobody in early 1945 believed the war would end quickly. The logistics reflected that grim assumption. Trucks kept arriving, crates kept stacking. The supply chain did not know how to slow down, because slowing down had never been part of the plan. Then, in the span of a single summer, the plan became meaningless. Japan's surrender in August 1945 did something no military strategist had fully prepared for. It did not just end the fighting. It ended the need for almost everything sitting in those Pacific warehouses. Ships that had been steaming toward invasion staging areas were suddenly redirected or simply stopped. Factories back home shifted overnight from war production to consumer goods, leaving mountains of already manufactured equipment with nowhere to go. And overseas, in bases like the ones scattered across the Philippines, the United States military found itself sitting on an almost unbelievable surplus. Trucks, jeeps, bulldozers, generators, spare parts by the ton. Equipment that had been rushed across the ocean for a war that no longer existed. Shipping it all home was not simple. Every vessel capable of hauling cargo was suddenly needed to bring home millions of exhausted, homesick soldiers, not machinery. Priority went to people, not property. That left an ocean of hardware behind, quietly rusting under tropical rain, with almost nobody left to decide what to do with it. The numbers were staggering enough to give war planners nightmares. Some historians estimate that American forces left behind or disposed of billions of dollars in surplus equipment across the Pacific theater alone, valued in wartime dollars, worth many times that today. Depots in the Philippines held vehicles that had cost thousands of dollars each to design, build, and ship overseas. Now they sat under camouflage netting that no longer needed to hide anything, guarded by men who just wanted to go home. The war had ended, but the problem it left behind was only beginning. Picture warehouses of unused trucks stretching farther than the eye could see, tarps flapping in the humid wind, engines that had never been started sitting silent under a merciless sun. As the celebrations of victory faded, a colder, more practical crisis took hold. What do you do with an army's worth of machinery when the army no longer needs it? Selling it back to the American public seemed obvious, but shipping heavy vehicles across the Pacific was staggeringly expensive, more costly in many cases than simply building new ones once factories retooled for peacetime. Selling it locally created a different problem. Flooding markets with cheap military surplus could crush local economies, still recovering from years of occupation and war damage. Filipino leaders, already grappling with a nation devastated by Japanese occupation and the brutal battles of liberation, watched warily as American commanders debated what to do with mountains of nearly new machinery sitting just beyond their reach. Military officials weighed several options, and each one came with its own political landmine. Donating the vehicles to the fledgling Philippine government seemed generous, but questions arose over cost, maintenance, and whether it would be seen as favoritism or interference in a nation just beginning to govern itself after independence was promised for 1946. Auctioning equipment to private buyers risked creating black markets for military-grade vehicles in a region still unstable after years of war. Shipping everything home meant competing for limited cargo space against the far more urgent priority of bringing exhausted soldiers back to their families. And storing it indefinitely meant paying to guard, maintain, and protect assets that were losing value with every passing month of tropical humidity and jungle rot. Behind closed doors, quartermaster officers and army logistics planners debated cost-per-unit disposal figures, weighing the price of shipping a single truck home against the price of simply destroying it where it sat. Some officers argued that scrapping and burial were the only realistic options given the sheer volume involved. Others pushed back, insisting that destroying usable machinery while the Philippines rebuilt from rubble was not just wasteful, it was almost cruel. The decision came down not to what was right, but to what was fast, cheap, and easiest to explain in a budget report. And so, quietly, without headlines or announcements, the order went out. Certain surplus stockpiles, deemed too costly to ship, too risky to sell, and too inconvenient to donate, would simply be destroyed, bulldozed, buried, erased from the ledger books as if they had never existed at all. This is where the story becomes almost impossible to believe, and yet accounts from veterans, local residents, and post-war investigators describe scenes that sound more like myth than military policy. Across the Pacific, similar disposal operations were already becoming infamous. On the island of Espiritu Santo, American forces pushed staggering quantities of trucks, bulldozers, and equipment straight off the coastline into the ocean rather than pay to ship it home, creating an underwater graveyard so vast that divers still explore it today, a place locals nicknamed $1 Million Point for the fortune sitting silently on the seafloor. The Philippines, according to persistent accounts passed down through American veterans and Filipino locals near former military installations, saw its own version of this story play out on land instead of underwater. Bulldozer operators reportedly dug massive pits, some large enough to swallow dozens of vehicles at once, and pushed nearly new Dodge trucks into the earth before covering them over with soil and letting the jungle reclaim the site. 2,000 trucks, buried like a secret nobody wanted to keep, yet nobody wanted to explain. The exact number has shifted depending on who tells the story, and official paperwork on these disposal operations is frustratingly thin, a detail that only deepens the mystery rather than resolving it. Some veterans who served in logistics units after the surrender described watching perfectly functional trucks driven directly into freshly dug trenches, their engines still running, before earth movers closed the pits behind them. Others recalled entire motor pools sitting untouched for months, slowly succumbing to rust and jungle vines, before quietly disappearing from base inventories with no clear record of where they went. Local residents living near former American installations have long shared stories passed through generations about strange mounds of earth in the jungle that, when disturbed, revealed twisted metal, rubber tires, and rusted axles beneath the surface. Farmers ploughing fields decades later reportedly struck buried steel where no steel should have been. Treasure hunters and amateur historians have combed old base maps for decades, chasing rumors of these lost stockpiles, some claiming partial discoveries, most finding nothing but disappointment and dense undergrowth. Why bury rather than simply abandon the vehicles in the open? Accounts suggest practical military reasoning mixed with a strange kind of institutional embarrassment. Leaving equipment scattered and visible risked scavengers, black market resale, and diplomatic headaches if valuable. American military hardware ended up in the wrong hands during an unstable post-war transition. Burial solved several problems at once. It cleared land quickly for returning bases to either be demolished or handed over. It removed liability. It erased evidence of waste that could embarrass military budgets already under intense scrutiny from a war-weary American Congress eager to slash spending. And it required nothing more than the bulldozers and manpower already sitting idle on base, machines that, ironically, were often the very same equipment scheduled to be buried themselves once their work was finished. Somewhere in that jungle, the ground itself became a filing cabinet for a decision the army never wanted to put in writing. Consider what those trucks actually represented before they vanished into the ground. Each Dodge WC Series truck rolling off the line in Detroit or Warren, Michigan carried a price tag that, when multiplied across thousands of units, ran into figures that would make any accountant wince. Steel, rubber, copper wiring, precision-machined engine components all funneled across an ocean at enormous expense during a war where every ton of cargo space was treated as sacred. These were not cheap, disposable machines. They were engineered to survive years of brutal combat conditions, built with a level of mechanical durability that many of them, ironically, still possessed the day they were driven into the earth. Veterans who witnessed the disposal operations often described a strange, almost eerie feeling standing beside vehicles that ran perfectly, engines humming, tires still gripping fresh factory tread, moments before they were pushed into trenches that would become their tombs. It was not decay that killed these machines. It was paperwork, budget lines, and the impossible math of post-war logistics. The men who carried out these orders were, by most accounts, ordinary soldiers and junior officers, simply following instructions passed down from commanders eager to close bases and go home themselves. Few of them questioned what they were doing at the time. The war had just ended. Exhaustion ran deeper than curiosity. If a colonel said bury it, you buried it, and you tried not to think too hard about the value sitting beneath your bulldozer blade. Decades later, some of those same men, interviewed as elderly veterans by local historians and curious journalists, described the burials with a mixture of guilt and disbelief, as if even they could not quite explain why the decision had been made the way it was. One recurring detail surfaces again and again in these second-hand accounts: the speed. Entire motor pools disappeared in a matter of days, not months, suggesting a level of urgency that went beyond simple administrative housekeeping. Bases were being decommissioned on tight timelines, land was being returned to Filipino control, and nobody wanted lingering questions about what to do with mountains of unclaimed hardware complicating the handover. There is also a darker layer to this story that historians have only recently begun to examine seriously. In the immediate aftermath of the war, tensions simmered beneath the surface of American and Filipino relations, even amid genuine gratitude and alliance. Independence was approaching fast, promised for July of 1946, and American officials were acutely aware that anything perceived as dumping, exploiting, or disrespecting Filipino sovereignty in those final months of colonial administration could poison the relationship for years to come. Flooding the local economy with cut-rate military trucks might have undercut Filipino manufacturers and dealers just beginning to rebuild. Handing over equipment seen as damaged goods, cast-offs the Americans no longer wanted, carried its own uncomfortable symbolism at a moment when the two nations were trying to project partnership, not charity. Burial, strange as it sounds, may have felt to some planners like the cleanest option precisely because it avoided every one of these political landmines. No local market disruption, no accusations of favoritism, no embarrassing photographs of American trucks flooding Manila streets at bargain prices, while the nation struggled to rebuild from the devastation of the Battle of Manila, one of the most destructive urban battles of the entire Pacific War. Erasing the surplus quietly, without ceremony or announcement, sidestepped a dozen potential controversies at once. Not every piece of surplus met this fate, and the broader story of post-war disposal in the Philippines is far stranger and more varied than most people realize. Some vehicles were sold to Filipino businesses and farmers at steep discounts, becoming the backbone of a post-war transportation boom that helped rebuild shattered infrastructure. Converted surplus trucks became early jeepneys, the now iconic vehicles that still define Philippine streets today, born directly from stripped-down military jeeps and trucks left behind after the war. Other equipment was donated to the new Philippine government to help establish its own post-war military and civil infrastructure. Some machinery ended up scattered across private collections, quietly repurposed for logging, agriculture, or construction throughout the islands. Museums decades later would recover a handful of surviving vehicles, restored and displayed as reminders of a war that had reshaped an entire nation. But amid all these legitimate, traceable paths surplus equipment took, the burial pits remain the strangest chapter, a decision made in secrecy, executed without fanfare, and left almost entirely undocumented in official records available to the public. Researchers who have tried to track down concrete evidence describe a frustrating pattern. Military records from the immediate post-war demobilization period are famously incomplete, rushed, and inconsistent, a byproduct of an army rapidly shrinking from over 8 million personnel to a fraction of that within roughly a year. Paperwork that might have detailed exact disposal locations, quantities, and reasoning was often never filed at all, considered low priority amid the chaos of shutting down an empire's worth of overseas bases almost overnight. What survives instead is oral history, veteran testimony collected decades later, and local folklore that has calcified into something between legend and forgotten fact. When the paperwork disappears, the jungle becomes the only witness left. Some of the most surprising revelations to emerge from this story go far beyond the trucks themselves. Veterans have described entire caches of spare engine parts, still packed in factory grease, buried alongside the vehicles, essentially entombing brand new machinery that had never even been assembled. Others recall stockpiles of tires, batteries, and radio equipment vanishing into similar pits, destroyed not because they were broken, but because destroying them was administratively simpler than accounting for them. There are accounts of experimental amphibious vehicles, tested briefly in the Philippines during the final push against Japanese forces, disappearing from records entirely after the surrender, their fate never officially explained. Local guides near old base sites have long claimed to know the rough locations of several of these pits, describing depressions in the earth that never quite match the surrounding terrain, ground that sits slightly lower, slightly different, as if something enormous were resting just beneath the surface. And perhaps strangest of all, several separate burial sites across different islands in the Pacific Theater seem to describe an almost identical pattern, suggesting this was not an isolated decision by one frustrated officer, but something closer to unofficial standard practice repeated quietly across multiple commands facing the exact same impossible surplus problem. Nobody signed an order that said, "Bury the trucks," but somehow, in jungle after jungle, island after island, the trucks kept disappearing into the ground anyway. The long-term legacy of these decisions stretches far beyond rusted metal hidden under Philippine soil. The post-war disposal crisis fundamentally reshaped how the United States military handles logistics and surplus even today, leading to far more structured demobilization planning in every conflict since. Modern military logistics doctrine studies these exact failures, the chaos of 1945 and 1946, as cautionary case studies in what happens when victory arrives faster than a plan for peace. The jeepney, born from scavenged surplus jeeps, remains one of the most visible and beloved symbols of Filipino culture, a direct, colorful descendant of this very chapter of history. Collectors and military historians still chase rumors of buried equipment across old Pacific bases, occasionally turning up genuine finds that confirm the old stories were rooted in real events, even if exaggerated with each retelling. A handful of recovered Dodge trucks from Pacific surplus operations survive today in private collections and small museums, hauntingly pristine considering the fate so many of their siblings met underground. And the broader story serves as a strange, almost poetic reminder that even the most powerful military machine in history could be defeated, not by an enemy, but by its own overwhelming success, drowning in a surplus it never planned for and did not know how to put down gently. So somewhere in that jungle, the earth is still keeping its secret. 2,000 trucks, or perhaps more, perhaps fewer than legend claims, sitting silently beneath decades of root and rust, monuments to a war that ended so suddenly the machinery built to fight it never had anywhere left to go. Every rainy season, the ground shifts a little more. Every so often, a farmer's plow strikes something it shouldn't. And every time it does, the old story gets told again, passed from one generation to the next, still unproven, still irresistible, still waiting for someone with a shovel, a permit, and enough patience to finally answer the question that has lingered in that soil since 1946. What else did they bury alongside the trucks, and why, after all these decades, has no one been allowed to dig deep enough to find out?